Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So for today's reading, I thought I would continue with another talk from the same book, Luang Por Sumedho's Don't Take Your Life Personally. And yesterday's was sort of loosely on the theme of Marnasati, and this one sort of falls under the category of Buddhanusati, sort of, more or less. It's a talk that was from 2nd of August 2001, and it's titled Buddha Knows Dhamma. I went to Thailand to become a monk in 1966, when the forest tradition was already becoming highly regarded there. Prior to decent roads and railways in Thailand, not many people knew about the Dudhanga monks, the forest monks. Now they are the most famous. Even Ajahn Mahabua got his picture in the Guardian newspaper recently and has become a sort of celebrated international figure. Over the years, there has been a lot of disillusionment with the traditional town and city monasteries in Thailand, and scandals have been reported about them in Thai newspapers. So it is the forest tradition that is now revered. Even the king has gravitated towards it, and whatever the king does, everybody else also tends to do. Now, in the Thai forest tradition, practices are given around the word Buddho, Buddha, the awakened one. It is used as a kind of mantra. Instead of wandering in thought and getting caught up in conceptual proliferations, one can use this two-syllable word, Buddho. Luang Por Chah used it, and so did Ajahn Mahabua, Ajahn Mun, and all these celebrated Thai forest ajahns. They base their practice on the discipline, vinaya, and mindfulness around daily life, and then the Buddho can be used as a mantra. If one repeats this mantra over and over again, the tendency for the mind to wander diminishes, and after a while, just these two syllables, Buddho, sustain themselves. One can get to the point then of even dropping those two syllables, and there remains a sense of emptiness and tranquility, which is the result of the cessation of the proliferating thinking mind. So this Buddho can be used as a kind of inner chant and tranquilizing technique. I found that its real value, however, was in reminding me of the inner Buddho, this sense of awakened attention, this taking refuge in the Buddha, this Buddhang saranam gacchami, I take refuge in the Buddha, as we say. Putting this into the awareness, the development of attention to life, has great significance. You begin to see the power of the word Buddha itself as the awakened, that which is awake, aware. Buddha can remain in our minds as a kind of historical figure, or we can talk about Buddha as some kind of force in the universe. Alternatively, we can speculate about it. In terms of insight meditation practice, however, we do not speculate about anything. We do not try to figure out whether there actually was a Buddha or question whether his life is historically accurate. Can we prove that the Buddha actually walked on 7 lotuses when he was born? Are we going to say we won't believe it until we have actual historical proof? But that is ridiculous. That is just concerning ourselves with things that aren't really important and can only be guessed at. Either believe or don't believe, but don't make a problem about it. Buddho, then, is something we internalize. When when we say Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, the traditional Theravada formula in Pali for taking refuge in the Buddha, it can be undertaken as a kind of ceremony, or it can become perfunctory. People just saying it parrot fashion, not realizing the significance of it as a sense of refuge. In meditation, however, we are dealing with the forces of nature, and a lot of them are pretty terrifying and dark. So if we don't feel a sense of safety within ourselves, we could become very frightened by things that arise in consciousness. They can be threatening on a personal level. But in this sense of refuge, we transcend the personal habits we have. The point is, we need a mirror in order to see our own personality as just a series of reflections rather than as a reality. So Buddho is like that mirror. You can also call it mindfulness, awakeness, or awareness. I have used Buddho for years in my own practice and have found it very helpful. If your mind is very active, thinking, proliferating, you can keep it busy with something like Buddho rather than worrying about whether the sky is going to fall in on you or what is going to happen next year. Mala beads can also be used while using the Buddho, 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 just keeping up with this refrain and keeping the mind busy in a way that is not just following and reinforcing negative habits of worry, fear, and anxiety about yourself, the future, or the past. If you're going to think, just think Buddho. As I say, you can use it with mala beads, which work very well with this, or you can use it with the breath. Inhaling pu, exhaling to. This keeps your attention. Your mind doesn't wander. You're just thinking this two-syllable word, just deliberately thinking in a way that does not convey proliferation. Buddho is independent, so it doesn't lead you into thoughts about something else. Now, being the Buddho, being Buddha, is the really important one. How does that strike you? Ajahn Sumedho thinks he's the Buddha. But I think if I'm the Buddha, that is not being Buddha, is it? That is my personality, thinking some deluded thought. Being Buddha is not a personality thing. It's not a personal attainment, but an immanent act of attention. However, if I be Buddha, as it were, that reflects the Ajahn Sumedho, the sense of me being this person that wants to be or doesn't want to be or whatever. I have different names now. When you get into the monastic system, you get all kinds of names. My mother named me Robert. In my generation in the States, however, two-syllable words were too much to expect, so it ended up as Bob all the time. And I never liked the sound of that, Bob. So I was glad to change it. Sumedho, I think, is a little more dignified. But in Thailand, when you get to my age, you get these venerable monikers as well, like Luang Por, which means something like revered father and things like that. But these are just conventions that have come into the system. They're not meant to be things that hold you on a personal level. The real refuge, of course, is in the awareness. Buddho, then, is Buddha knows Dhamma. This is the paradigm of consciousness where there is the subject and the object. When I talk about the absolute subject, this is the Buddho. You can put it that way. You can also call it refuge in the Buddha or being Buddha. It is just the tension of the moment where you rest in this point of stillness and silence, and you can't get beyond this point. You can go out to the turning wheel, But if you stay in the still point, T.S. Eliot's The Still Point of the Turning World is a good image. That is being Buddha. Now, this is just for contemplation, for beginning to see how to use traditional words to actually help us to awaken and be attentive, rather than leaving them as exotic terms that we adopt as part of our vocabulary. See them as useful ways of reminding ourselves to be in this state of attention, this awareness. The relationship of Buddha to Dhamma, then, is that which is awake knows the Dhamma. So the Dhamma is the truth of the way it is. That word Dhamma is all about our experience in the present. It is all Dhamma. Conditions are Dhammas. They arise and cease. And the Amata Dhamma, the deathless or unborn, is the reality that we begin to recognize in this position of Buddho, of being Buddha. Sometimes we say, well, that's life, that's the way it is, in a kind of negative, complaining way with a sense of resignation to unfairness or injustice or whatever. We say, well, what can you do? But that is not Buddha knowing Dhamma. In the sense of Buddha knowing Dhamma the way it is, has no judgment in it. It isn't a question of comparing the way it is with the ideals of what we would like or what should be. It is simply like this. And there is a sense of sustaining this Buddho, this attention. I find also that by just resting in the sound of silence, this kind of resonating vibration, the thinking mind stops. And yet there is a sense of being in this pure presence, the state of being Buddha that is quite natural and sustainable. This is not a cultivated, unnatural state. Luang Por Chah used to call it our real home. It is where we can rest, where we can be, and it is natural. So we don't have to make it, hold it, or keep depending on conditions to allow it to exist. When we begin to recognize this, we realize that it is the way it is. All the time, whether conditions are pleasant or horrible. This is the refuge. Learning to trust in this refuge allows us to integrate into the life that we have with all its distractions, problems, difficulties, pleasures, and pains. Once we really get a feeling and an understanding of this reality, we can go wherever we want and always be in this state of awareness, because it isn't destroyed by the conditions that we are experiencing. This, however, takes real surrender and faith. The word surrender often gives the impression of one giving up, of a kind of negative, unconditional surrender. It may be better to use the word relaxation if the word surrender is too much for us. What I am pointing to is this letting go, just this trusting in something we can't objectively hold up or let others know about. We can know it intuitively, of course, and we can begin to trust it rather than just trusting in the personality which endlessly doubts and gets caught in feeling intimidated by what others say or by all the other experiences we have. As a Buddhist monk, I am in the center of a worldwide Buddhist movement, so I get all these things coming at me, different attitudes, views, opinions, and challenges. If I didn't have this strength within, it would be pretty difficult sometimes. One can feel like a ping pong ball, just being battered from one end of the table to the other by so many strong views and opinions. The Buddhist world is chock-a-block full of them, and then there are the New Age groups, the interfaith groups, the scientists, and so on. The encouragement I give, however, is to learn to recognize intuitive wisdom. It isn't that difficult. It isn't so refined and special that it is beyond any of us. It isn't something we will miss if we are not absolutely at our peak. We begin to realize, in fact, that intuitive wisdom is so ordinary that we just might not notice it. Like the space in the room, or the fish in the water that says, "I'm looking for water," whilst being surrounded by it. We are surrounded. The Buddho is everywhere. It isn't some special, refined type of samadhi, some concentrated state that we get as a result of living in a cave for 10 years. It is accessible all the time because it is here and now. And the here and now can hold anything: war or peace, health or sickness, a blossoming life or a life that is falling apart, whatever. None of these things is a problem, really, for this sense of refuge. The problem is not with the conditioned realm, but with how we understand it. The Buddha Dhamma Sangha brings us into the reality of our own human limitation. It is not just in terms of Buddha Dhamma, the Buddha's teaching, but also in terms of our humanity, the Sangha or community, in being men and women with interests and the determination to practice. Sangha is not something personal. It isn't a question of taking it as some kind of personal quality. It always has this sense of the group. The church in Christianity, Sangha in Buddhism. We are not operating on an individual level of, I'm Ajahn Sumedho. I'm going to do my practice independently. I don't need you. I can do it myself. I don't need those monks and nuns and all those people. I'm going to prove that I can do it and get it together all on my own. There's no sense of humility in that. That is the ego, which is determined to sustain itself as an independent condition. Sangha, then, has this sense of the group, of all of us taking refuge in that which is good, in our humanity, which refrains from doing evil and does good in terms of morality, of sila, or generosity, dana. We don't just think of ourselves. The encouragement always is to help, to share, to be generous. And there is the commitment to practice, the intention to give up selfish, personal preferences for the welfare of the Sangha. So the Sangha works as a refuge in the world of living, breathing humanity. But then it gets misinterpreted. It gets idealized or relegated to meaning only arhants or only highly attained beings or only monks. You hear people say that in order to take refuge in the Sangha, you have to become a monk or a nun. Somebody told me he couldn't be a Buddhist because he didn't want to shave his head. But you can be a Buddhist and keep your hair. As I've said before, the sound of silence to me is this still point. We can see a point as one little dot, aim for it, and exclude everything else in the process. Or we can see the point as something that includes everything, as in the case of intuitive awareness, sati sampajanya. When we are into the more conditioned aspects of our personality, we see a point, concentrate on it, and have to suppress and separate off all that is outside of that point. The other way of looking at it is to see the point as that which includes. To me, this is what right concentration in the Eightfold Path really means. It is not shutting the world out. It is not absorbing just into this very refined little point in order to get right concentration. It is the point that includes everything. Everything belongs, and that means everything good as well as bad. So when I rest in this silence, in this stillness, it is like a point, but it includes everything. I don't have to close my eyes, turn round and look away, or even stop talking in order to be in this still point, because it includes even my talking right now. My talking like this is not interfering with this still point. The still point, or the sound of silence, has this sense of expansiveness. It has no boundary and just seems to permeate everywhere. At first, you might think of the sound of silence as some kind of buzz in the ear. Some people, when they hear it, don't like it because they identify it as tinnitus or something annoying. The word buzz itself isn't a particularly nice word, is it? When we talk about buzzes, it usually refers to unpleasant sounds. If we call it a hum, that would be better, because what you call it helps you accept it. If you call it tinnitus, you're just going to hate it. But if you call it the primordial sound, or the cosmic hum, or Krishna's flute, it's more interesting. It seems to be that which is before everything. Because if you recognize it and stay with it for a while, you begin to find that you stop thinking. And when you stop thinking, you stop recreating your emotional habits. You stop busily protecting and controlling. Thought proliferates. So when you think, you just go from one thought to another. You might manage to stop yourself thinking, but then it starts up again, and you get angry with yourself for thinking too much when you don't want to. So you might ask yourself, how can I stop the thinking? I'm such an obsessive thinker. I just think too much. How can I stop it? But if you're going to think, do it deliberately. Don't just wander in thought, but deliberately think, Buddho say. Then you will cease being averse to your thinking mind. You will cease trying to stop thinking and will just accept it. You will just rest in the silence. Then you'll have the sense of emptiness. The sound of silence can seem like a buzz in the ear, maybe, but as you trust it more, you realize that it is expansive, that it has no boundary, that it is everywhere and permeates everything. This is how I experience it. Even calling it sound can be misleading, because then one thinks of the perception one has of sound. It is more like something behind the sounds of everything. If you notice, it underlies, is the background, and is the one point that includes, and so includes all sounds. In the forest tradition, putting on and taking off the robes is regarded as one of the practices. You have this complicated robe to wear, and you are told when you first ordain. The monk should be mindful when putting on his robe and when taking off his robe. This is the ideal. We might not be used to being mindful around dressing and undressing. At least I wasn't. It wasn't something I was particularly interested in, and probably thought about anything but what I was doing at the time. Putting on the robe, then, is given as a practice. Actually, a lot of monks would love us to wear trousers instead, and part of me wouldn't mind that at all. But in another way, I feel somehow that after wearing this thing for so long, it would be a shame to give it up. Also, it is a way of accepting something that is not all that convenient, a bit of a trouble, and it has taught me a lot. The mind proliferates, complains, and judges. But from this still point, you see how you can really make yourself unhappy about things that aren't all that important. The way I see it, if this is the way they do it, then do it this way. Don't make it into a problem. Resting in this stillness allows the sense of putting on the robe without getting lost in the wandering mind or getting caught in the perfunctory habit of rushing in and putting it on as quickly as possible. These are ways of slowing down and giving more attention to the details of ordinary life. The same with washing the dishes or taking a bath. These things can be meditations in the sound of silence. I used to like washing the dishes at Amaravati after the morning porridge because it's cold in the winter on that hill. You can go into the scullery where there are these nice windows. The sun shines in, there are these deep stainless steel sinks which hold lots of hot water and nice suds. Then washing the dishes in the silence I found even sensually pleasant. When I was a child, my parents used to make my sister and me wash the dishes after dinner. Because of that, I developed an aversion to washing dishes. So my immediate personal reaction to doing it was, oh no, washing dishes. Of course, being the most senior monk at Amaravati, I can get out of jobs like that quite easily. It isn't as though they asked me to do it. But what I'm saying is that the perception of washing dishes can be a negative one. They have to be washed. Let's get them out of the way so we can go to the temple and practice. My personality thinks like that. You've got to wash the dishes. You've got to be responsible. You can't just leave all these dirty dishes around. They've got to be washed. That's sensible. So I'll wash them. I'll get them done as quickly as possible so that I can get to my practice, because practice is in the temple. It isn't in the scullery. So one can change from that perception to this sense of expansion, to the silence and stillness that contains everything. Then the one point that includes allows the scullery to be a place of practice. When one abides in this stillness, one can find a sort of pleasure even in doing something as ordinary as washing dishes. And as something one has to do every day, it is not really that unpleasant. This is learning to integrate the awareness. If you have the idea that you just have to be mindful without this sense of including whatever arises, you're always going to be failing at it. Then you will get discouraged and think, I can't practice in daily life. I can only really practice on retreat, where I don't have to wash the dishes or cook or talk to people. Then I can really practice. That's where it's at. In the office, in the supermarket, in the kitchen, at home with the kids screaming, I can't do it. That is seeing practice just in terms of being able to concentrate, in terms of not being aggravated by harsh impingement or a lot of activity. But that is like sensory deprivation, the kind of concentration you get by cutting off sensory contact to whatever is happening where you are. Your refuge, however, is in the still point, not in some idea that things are in your way. If I have the idea that I can only be mindful in a very controlled meditation retreat, then I am already primed to seeing everything else in life as an obstruction. So I'm being too narrow. I'm idealizing mindfulness and making it into something only possible when conditions are a particular way. Years ago, when I was a novice monk, I fell into a heap on the floor of my kuti and started crying. I can't do it. It's too much. I can never do this. And yet, while I was sobbing in a heap of anguish, there was something watching it all. It was like a program going on, but I was not that program. It was as though it wasn't me anymore, but it was happening, and there was something knowing it was happening, which wasn't a heap of anguish, and it was all very clear. If any of you had seen me at that time, you would have thought, oh, Ajahn Sumedho is really having a bad time. He's having a breakdown. I've never seen him so upset. That is why I say you can't judge these things, because if you had judged it from how it appeared, you would not have understood it. Many of you, I am sure, have found yourselves going off emotionally, yet with something at the back of you knowing it isn't that way. Emotions are conditioned into us, aren't they? That is why we can have very immature emotions, even when we are quite old. It is embarrassing to have childish emotions when you're a dignified 67-year-old bloke like I am, especially when you're supposed to be some kind of wise master of meditation. But I don't despair about it because it doesn't mean anything really. The teaching on dependent origination, paticcasamuppada, or what they call in Pali, iddhapachayata, is that when certain conditions arise, there are certain results. So, conditions arise for emotions, and emotions follow. That is why, if you're in the Buddho, this awareness, you have more of a perspective on what is happening, even though on a mature, intellectual, judgmental level, what has arisen might seem silly or foolish. There is a kind of superego that likes to knock you down and tell you how silly you are. But don't believe that either. That is another habit we have. Alternatively, we can trust in the Buddho and see that this emotional thing, no matter how foolish or silly it might appear, belongs at this moment. It is what is included in the point that includes, so it belongs. It is not something that should not be. As you relate to things like that, you can actually let them go. If you see them on a personal level, you are still holding to them in some way and are not allowing them to go. One monk recently went to see his family, and during his visit had these amazing emotional swings. The conditions were there for feelings that had not previously been resolved. Even though he is in his 30s, being at home brought up this sense of little boy and mother and father and all this kind of thing. If the conditions are present, no matter how old you are, this is how you feel. We might be annoyed or angry with our parents because we think they're making us feel like this, but they are not. It is just that the conditions are there. As we begin to understand it, we can at least work from this point. We don't have that much control, of course, over what our parents do. If I shout, "You always treat me like a child," they will just feel guilty and maybe try to act how they think I want them to. And then it goes back again to this other thing. It isn't a matter of making it into a problem, however, but of recognizing how our emotional nature can be stuck in patterns that we acquire when we are children. When we grow up, we try to take on the role of the adult, but underlying that, there might be emotional habits that have never been accepted and understood, and these can come out in breakdowns and so forth. And when people get old, they very often go through all sorts of things. My father went through a whole range of temper tantrums which stemmed from all the little things he had never resolved in his life. At 90. It is sad to see, isn't it? But realize you are going to have to face this at some time in your own life. So I want to encourage you to see that meditation includes this. It is not that we are just seeking a blissful state. In certain situations, we can revert to the most childish reactions. As we acknowledge this, however, and trust more in our awareness, then as these things come up, and we don't have to make them happen, they will just happen in our lives, we can trust in being the Buddho, the knower, rather than the personality that is having a tantrum. I think one of the points that is really articulated well, that Luang Por Sumedho once says, if you have the idea that you just have to be mindful without this sense of including whatever arises, you're always going to be failing at it. So this sense of somehow that mindfulness is some entity that you're going to get, or you're going to create, or you're going to inhabit somehow, rather than recognizing that, say, mindfulness is, or this quality of knowing, of awareness, of seeing clearly is recognizing whatever's there.
I remember being like a novice or one pasta bhikkhu in one of these early heart meetings and expressing I just have to get rid of all these emotions. And, now I see clearly how mistaken it is.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a. I mean, they're suffering, so we want to get rid of them. But it has a logical. It has a logical basis, but the Dhamma isn't just logical. It's like that axiom, sort of. I think, therefore I suffer. So if I didn't think, I wouldn't suffer, which is not true at all.
He talks about emptiness in this talk, and reading this book about emptiness, and talks about the Chula Sutta Sutta with the different progressive stages. I'm wondering what would be a way to approach that without getting too make abstract or trying to say cancel everything out. when cultivating that perception of space?
Well, one is in, say, inhabiting the sense of space. But the main thing in terms of say, emptiness is emptiness of self, emptiness of the kind of the I, me, mine program. That's the basis for say, emptiness. And in terms of, I mean, yes, there are these various relative emptinesses. Like this room is empty of elephants. I mean, it's empty, but it's a relative perception, and you can use that as a basis of reflecting on, okay, what emptiness is. But in the end, it's sort of the recognizing the fundamental empty nature of the kind of I, me, mine program. It's always insinuating itself into all experience.
Thinking about like what you're saying about not necessarily trying to get rid of emotion. Would you say that we're not trying to get rid of that program, but see how it in itself is empty?
Well, no, I mean, because that's another expression of self. Me trying to get rid of the I, me, and mine. That's why that sense of refuge in, say, in Buddha, or refuge in knowing, refuge in awareness is so important. And I like the way that Luang Por Sumedho has expressed that over many, many years, of that sense, the Buddha knowing the Dhamma, that is the basic fundamental hinge that gives one an opportunity for liberation. And it's more that awakened quality, seeing the way things truly are. And it's not adding or subtracting or being or becoming, or as Ajahn Chah sort of says, it's not about going forward, going back, or staying still. It's just, here it is.
I think like an important part of it is acknowledging the emotions.
Yeah.
He's talking about his 90-year-old father who had all these things coming up that hadn't been acknowledged throughout his life.
Yeah.
So it's like, like if I feel sadness or something, well, I'm not sad, but actually like, not denying it to myself, but acknowledging it to myself.
Yeah, it's just so, especially when, just as he says, in this, for ourselves as well, it doesn't fit into our image of being sort of the peaceful meditators and wise Buddhist practitioners, having these sort of childish emotions, or strong emotions. This sort of, it doesn't fit, so we try to cast it, push it away, or relabel them somehow. And yeah, it's just so important. It's okay. This is the way it is also.
How do you know the difference between emotions that you can choose to replace or choose to, like with anger, for example, choosing not to be angry, and emotions that you need to invite in and...
I don't know that you need to invite in anything. It's just sort of being aware of what is there, and then aware of what the consequence is, because there's consequences, and that's the aspect of discernment and attention, that we have to pay attention to what is the consequence of certain emotions, and when we feed them, or when we believe them, or when we get caught up in them. And is it useful? Is it beneficial? Is it for my happiness and well-being? Is it for the happiness and well-being of others? Is it for my own suffering? Is it for the suffering of others? So it's sort of seeing it in terms of, well, what's the effect, and then starting to experiment and work with them. That's why that sense of, I think, Ajahn Sumedho's way of using that point that includes, because the tendency of the mind is to exclude. The habit of the mind is to exclude, to push stuff away, and then to return to a place of knowing or attention, and so allowing it to include, but expanding that point so that it's being held.
In relation to what you're saying about the points that includes and not like narrowing or excluding, how would mindfulness of the body be understood? Is it like having that refuge in awareness and the awareness of the body being within that expanded awareness rather than like trying to like hold the awareness?
Well, a lot of it is, so much of our attempts to be mindful of the body is oftentimes desperately hanging on to a particular sensation, so that we're not shaken or moved, and loosening our grip a bit, and you can still pay attention to the same thing. I mean, it's just using the breath. There's a big difference when you're paying attention to the breath in a way that is allowing that kind of sensation to be experienced within the framework of the whole body, and then the sense around, or as opposed to just trying to focus in so that you don't lose that grip on that sensation of the breath. And it's the same breath, but it's a whole different approach, whole different feel, and a whole different result.
Seems really in line with the equanimity chant we do on Karma also. Like the beings are whatever karma I shall do, for good or for ill, I will be there. Kind of like those conditions come up, and that equanimity of just acknowledging those conditions were in place.
Yeah, I mean that's just sort of recognizing that there are causes and conditions in place, whether it's for personal or for in the circumstances we find ourselves in the world, and being able to see that from a causal perspective as opposed to either an impingement or a surprise or a shock. Okay.